Welcome to my How Healthy Are You weekly educational podcast. My name is Dr. Thomas Brewer. I'm a PhD chemist and nutritional blood microscopist. Today is October 10th, 2022, and this is podcast number 131. My next podcast will be November 7th. Now, the topic for this podcast is MRSA, MRSA. It's a very strong antibiotic-resistant superbug, and I'm going to go into its background and how to kill it. So MRSA stands for 4 words: methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Well, that's a mouthful, so let's break it down. Methicillin is an antibiotic. It is similar to penicillin. In fact, it's the next generation of antibiotics after penicillin. So that's the M. The R stands for resistant. No issue there. The S is Staphylococcus. Normally it's known as staph. It's normally abbreviated to staph. And the A is for aureus. So normally that bacteria is abbreviated as Staph aureus. It's a very common bacteria. And now it has become what's known as a superbug, which means it's a bacteria that is resistant to most antibiotics, just about all antibiotics. Now, we were getting a hold of MRSA issues in hospitals, but between 2019 and 2020, as a result of the cerveza sickness, there was a 34% increase in cases and an 80% increase in just Arizona. So what happened during that time, we used more antibiotics during the cerveza sickness because we didn't want people to have secondary infections, and excess antibiotic use always leads to the bacteria mutating. Now, a little bit of history here. Staph aureus is a common bacteria. It's normally on our skin and our nose, and it's really no problem if you're healthy. So at least half the people in the country have this bacteria on them, and it's no issue. There's lots of bacteria and viruses on our body, and our skin is our first line of defense. It's the first line of our immune system. But if this Staph aureus gets into the bloodstream, bad things happen, specifically pneumonia, and it can go all the way up to sepsis and death. So this is a bad bacteria if it gets into the bloodstream. Now, before we had penicillin, the mortality rate for Staph aureus, if it got into the bloodstream, was 80%. So 80% of the people died. So it's a very big deal, a lot bigger deal than the 1% or so with the cerveza sickness. And hopefully you know what I mean when I say cerveza. Now, before penicillin, of course, we had this high mortality rate, but what happened after we developed penicillin in the 1940s, within 2 years, the bacteria mutated and it became resistant to penicillin. Then came the next antibiotic, and this is the M in MRSA, methicillin. So that was introduced, and guess what? 2 years later, MRSA became resistant to methicillin. So by the 1960s, MRSA was starting to become a big issue. It's still a big issue. And the problem is it keeps getting stronger and more resistant every time we develop an antibiotic, except one. I'll get to that in just a moment. So in hospitals, this bacteria will infect the healthy and the sick people. Usually what happens is it will infect people right at an incision. So if they've had an operation or if they had some procedure where there was some puncture to the skin, that's where the MRSA starts the infection, then it gets into the bloodstream. It's very dangerous. So skin and soft tissue infections is how it works, usually through a surgical site. That's the most common source. Now, the only antibiotic that works is something that utilizes a different mechanism than the other antibiotics, and that is colloidal silver, specifically colloidal silver made with very high voltage. That's why I recommend the lightning colloidal silver. It's very unique because it's made with such high voltage. The silver ions are separated. They have a lot of charge, and the effectiveness of the colloidal silver is hundreds of times greater than colloidal silver made with household current. Now, the reason MRSA has this superbug status is it has a transmissible gene mutation. What that means is as the MRSA mutates and the genes mutate and they become resistant to antibiotics, that bacteria develops a drug-resistant gene that gets transmitted to other types of bacteria. So it's a transmissible gene mutation. So this is a very big problem. It's very bad for us because if there's any MRSA going around, then the MRSA will teach other bacteria to become resistant to antibiotics, which makes more and more bacteria get elevated to the status of a superbug. So the antibiotics that are used to kill this bacteria, MRSA, and most all bacteria, they target the cell membrane, the cell walls, but they don't target the whole cell. That's the difference with the lightning colloidal silver. It targets the whole bacteria, the whole cell, not just the outer wall. I use the analogy that lightning colloidal silver is like stepping on a bug with your foot versus just pushing it around. So very effective way of killing MRSA and other antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Now, this is a global crisis, and it seems to keep getting worse every year because we're fighting it very inefficiently, and that's typical of our CDC, quite inefficient, and they kind of handcuff themselves to their own rules. So here's what we can do. Like any bacteria or virus, keep your immune system strong. Now, the best ways to do this is to eat fruits and vegetables more than meats, get sunlight so you can make vitamin D, get efficient, high-quality sleep, and by all means take 3 Steromax per day, about 30 minutes before your first meal of the day. That will ensure a very, very strong immune system. So should you catch any bacteria or virus, well, make sure you have some lightning colloidal silver handy. Okay, so thank you for listening. Please leave a comment, and please don't keep me a secret.